Hi everyone, this is the introduction to symbolism video in part one of the fiction module. So we're going to be talking today about what a symbol is, and then we'll lead into how it is that we can recognize them in literature and what their function is in literature. So what is a symbol? I have the definition up here. It says a symbol is a physical object that represents or stands for something else, especially something abstract. And so it's a physical object, usually something that you can touch, that represents or stands in for something else that you can't necessarily touch. Okay, and this is an important thing for us as human beings. We're really good at dealing because we think abstractly. We think about ideas. We think about things that we can't see or touch, but sometimes it's hard for us to talk about those things, and so we will oftentimes use symbols to stand in for them. So let's see what I mean by that. So in the next slide, you can see I say that symbols usually have no real connection to the ideas that they represent. That is, if we're talking about some kind of an abstract idea, something that you can't touch, how do you make something physical that connects to that? And so let's look at a symbol we're very familiar with, the letter N, right? Actually, by the way, there's a number of symbols here. This little bullet point, this dot, is a symbol as well. But let's just focus on the letter N as a symbol. We know what that means, right? We know when we're reading how to pronounce that sound. But realize there's nothing about this shape that says that we should go right? If we wanted to, we could say that that sound is represented by something completely different, right? It could be represented by this symbol over here, right, that we call 5. We could change the letters around. In fact, some of you, of course, speak languages that don't use this alphabet, the alphabet that we use in English, and it might be clear to you that these symbols are arbitrary, right? Because in other languages, you might create this sound with a completely different symbol. So as I said, symbols usually have no real connection to the ideas they represent. There's nothing about this that tells us that it should be the sound of an N and not the sound of, let's say, a Z, which it's on sideways, or the sound of an S, right? There's nothing about this shape that tells us that. Similarly, there's nothing about this numeral 5, right, that tells us anything about how many things that you have, right? Somebody coming from another language that doesn't use these particular symbols can't look at this and go, oh, I can understand that you have, these are the same number of fingers that you have on your hand. There's nothing about this symbol that tells us anything about that concept of the number. And all of our numbers are the same way, right? There's nothing about those numbers that tells us anything about how many items that we're actually talking about. And so this idea that symbols don't represent they represent something, but they don't have this kind of physical connection between those two. I put in here the Google Chrome symbol that some of you might be familiar with. There's nothing that we could look at this signal and say, oh, I understand that. And when I just see that, if you didn't know any better, you wouldn't know that this tells us anything about Google Chrome. And if you don't know Google Chrome, it's the web browser. Many of you, of course, use it. There's nothing about this that says we're talking about Google Chrome. They created it because they found that it was, eye-catching. It was something that's easy, easy for people to recognize. But there's no real relationship between those. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind about symbols. And it is important to then to differentiate. See how there is a difference between a symbol and a metaphor. So symbols versus metaphor. Metaphors take qualities from an object and apply them to another object or idea. So let's look at this oil and water, which should be familiar to us from Battle of the Breaths. The filmmaker there used the oil and water to talk about how she feels that she's not able to mix her home culture with her newfound American culture. But this is a metaphor and not a symbol, because you can look at this and think about, oh, look, the oil is not mixing with the water. And so we understand that there is a relationship between her culture and the other culture, right? The oil doesn't mix with the water, just like her Indian culture doesn't mix with the American culture. And so that's what makes this a metaphor. There's a connection here. There's a relationship between these two. But again, symbols, just going back to the symbols, there's nothing about N that tells us anything about the sound. There's nothing about 5 that tells us, how many objects we have. There's nothing about this Google Chrome symbol that tells us anything about this, what this application can do. And so recognize the difference between those two. Sometimes they do cross. Sometimes there will be things that are symbolic that also have a little bit of a metaphorical content to them, but just use the difference between them, right? Metaphors take qualities from the object and apply that, whereas symbols, there isn't going to be a real connection. So let's look at some other symbols that we might have here. What we have if you remember from the reading that you had, those 3 pages of reading that you had, we talked about what's called a traditional symbol. Traditional symbols are symbols that everybody recognizes, right? The 5, the N, the Google Chrome, everybody agrees on those symbols. And here's another traditional symbol that we can recognize, at least in the United States or in other Western cultures, the wedding dress, right? And realize that, again, there's nothing about a wedding dress that says that somebody's getting married. We can't say, oh, because it's got ruffles in here, that says something about being married. There's something about these decorations here that tell us about being married. There's something about these flowers. None of these things say themselves anything about being married. We have just decided that that's what that means. And it's okay. We can decide that just like we all decide what the letters of the alphabet mean. So we decide that this wedding dress, this type of dress, is going to represent being married. And it's a very specialized thing. We know if somebody wears a wedding dress at some other time, if somebody's just walking down the street wearing a wedding dress, you think that person's crazy, right? Because you aren't supposed to do that, because this represents this very specific thing, right? Also, to be clear, dress is for the person who's going to be getting married. If somebody else shows up at the wedding wearing a wedding dress, you're going to have a problem. There's going to be a fight there, because only the person getting married is supposed to wear the wedding dress. So it represents something that's going on. And again, that's made up. We can recognize that wedding dresses generally have this quality. They're usually white. They're usually decorated in this kind of particular way. And so that's something that we've all decided on as a culture. Again, that makes it a traditional symbol. And these kind of symbols are all around us. Almost all of our clothing is about symbols, right? That is, otherwise we just, we could wear sacks or something like that. But our clothes say something about who we are. And so that's what's going to make them symbolic. Other traditional symbol, wedding ring. And again, it's not accidental that we have lots of symbols related to things like that, right? This is a ceremony, and when you have a ceremony, a special event like this, we want to have symbols. So you can have, of course, I'm sorry, it's an engagement ring, right? And here we can have a wedding ring, right? That shows that people are in fact married, right? But realize that, again, there's nothing specific about this type of ring that says that people are going to get married. And we can do other things. If we were to say that people are married. We had the poem Dothead. And in Dothead, the poet in there was talking about how kids were making fun of him because his mother wore what's called a Sindoor. Sometimes people will call it a bindi, but it's actually something else. And so it's a Sindoor, which is going to be the dot here that these women are going to wear that says that they're married. Which is the right one, a wedding ring or a Sindoor? Well, there's no right one. It's just something that everybody decided on, right? So these are all traditional symbols, but it is important to recognize that as you move from one culture to the next, we might end up with different traditional symbols. Other traditional symbols that we're aware of, flags, right? This is United States. We should recognize that as New York. I'm originally from Florida, so I put Florida in there. This is England, Jamaica, Mexico. All of these are going to be symbols. They just represent either the country or the state. And there's nothing about these flags that say anything about that. So let's look at other traditional symbols of the flags. Let's look at various American flags. This is the original American flag that only had 13 stars. The stars represent how many states we have. And so when the United States first first began, there were only 13, and so the flag only has 13 states on it, 13 stars on it. Here's another flag that has 13 stars. We can arrange them differently, and these are all standard American flags. And somebody might come through and say, "Wait a minute, that's a different flag, or that's this doesn't represent the United States. This is a flag that only has 48 states before Alaska and Hawaii. Here's the one that we recognize now that has 50 states." And somebody might say, "Well, wait, that's not an American flag, right?" Now it's not, but it was. We just had to all decide, okay, this is a new symbol. So again, it's a traditional symbol, and we all decide, let's change what that is, right? Now, I put this in here, and somebody might say, well, when was this an American flag? This is not an American flag. This is actually a Liberian flag. Liberia is a country that was founded by former slaves from the United States, and they adopted a similar flag. It looks very similar, but they only have one star since they don't have states like we do. And I just put that in there so that you can recognize that there is this kind of, there isn't a real connection between the flag itself and the country, right? You might say, that's an American flag. That has something. Well, no. I mean, it is supposed to relate somewhat to America, but it's not, right? We've agreed that is, in fact, actually the Liberian flag. So again, flags are going to be traditional symbols. Other traditional symbols, consumer products. We know what that is. We should know that is probably. Mercedes, Nike, Audi. Here, this is Coach. They make handbags. And we might say on some level that this C is supposed to represent Coach, but it kind of moves beyond that, right? You don't have to even think about the Coach to do that. Gucci, the same way. You can see that there is a G in there to represent Gucci, but it's kind of moved beyond that so that you don't actually have to think about the G to say what this symbol potentially means. So all of those are traditional symbols. And let's go on to what we call literary symbols. Literary symbols are going to be symbols that only exist in a work of literature, either in a poem, a short story, a play, a movie, a TV show. And so here's a symbol. I mentioned this in I'll mention this, you'll come across this in one of your discussion boards. In Harry Potter, he's got this scar on his forehead. And if you're familiar with the story, this scar was obtained when he was much younger, and he was going to get in a parent battle with Voldemort and all of that. And this scar represents, the trauma that he's been through. It represents his parents sacrificed for him. It represents his destiny, right? He's going to be something important, right? When people see that he's the guy with the star, with the scar, when they see that he's the person with the scar, they know that, he's destined to do big things in the story. So that scar ends up representing something for him. So it is a symbol. In Star Wars, the lightsaber is a symbol. You might think, why is a lightsaber a symbol? Well, the reason is that it's a terrible weapon, right? People have got these blasters. They can, shoot lasers and stuff at people. They have Death Stars. But the Jedi are going to use these very simple and elegant weapons. And really, the only reason we do that is because they're symbols. They represent something, right? It's not because they're the best weapon. They represent something about who the Jedi are. And so keep that in mind. And symbols show up in all kinds of ways like that. So just the idea of this particular kind of a weapon, if you ever wondered why anybody would use this kind of weapon, again, it's because it's going to be a symbol. And so you'll find symbols in all kinds of places like that. So the next thing I want you to, there's a video that you'll need to watch in here called Ben's Glasses. It's actually a commercial for eyeglasses. And I want you to think about the symbolism of glasses. Now, right now, glasses don't represent anything to you, right? They're glasses. You use glasses to be able to see. But when you watch this commercial, it's really like a short movie, you will see that these glasses begin to represent something else. So I want you to watch the film, the commercial. Think about what the glasses represent, and then there's a very short one-question quiz that I'll ask you about what is it that those glasses actually represent. And again, you can see then in this case how in this very short film, these glasses can become a literary symbol.